What if history's most proper women weren't so proper after all? Behind every royal portrait, beneath layers of lace and duty, lurked whispers of forbidden obsessions, secret vows, and desires that shook empires. These aren't the queens and princesses you read about in school. These are the women the crown tried to forget. 33 royals, centuries of scandal. One question that still haunts the throne. What happens when a woman wants more than power? This is 33 most perverted female British royals you never knew, and none of them were as innocent as they looked. Before we dive in, take a second to hit subscribe, especially if you love the strange, forgotten corners of royal history they don't teach in textbooks. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Texas? We want to know who else is wide awake with us, wandering through the archives of royal obsession. 1. Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was young. Too young, some whispered. Too spirited, others murmured. But Henry VIII, deep in the twilight of his sixth and final romantic delusion, preferred to think of her as a rose without a thorn, which of course was poetic nonsense. Roses have thorns, and Catherine's were the kind that left a bleeding mess. By Tudor standards, she was practically a teenager when she caught the eye of the aging king. A teenager with scandal trailing behind her like a satin train, though the court, pretending not to notice, tiptoed delicately around it. After all, Henry needed a distraction from his gout, his ulcers, and his collapsing masculinity. Catherine offered just enough perfume and plausible deniability to do the trick. What Henry didn't know, or didn't want to know, was that Catherine's girlish innocence had already been bruised by the wild undercurrents of the Dowager Duchess's household, where servants shared beds and affections were negotiated behind curtains. Later whispers claimed that Catherine was fond of night walks, shared songs, and a particular music teacher who believed in extra tutoring. Whether any of this was love, coercion, rebellion, or survival, no one really knew. But the stories grew teeth once she married the king. At court, Catherine did what many a bored young queen has done when married to a man more than twice her age with a penchant for power and zero subtlety. She flirted. She hosted entertainments. She indulged in perfumes, lace, and secrets. And, according to her enemies, she reconnected with a past lover under the cover of dim halls and royal privilege. Historians still debate whether she was reckless or merely careless, naive or manipulative, foolish or doomed. It doesn't really matter. In Henry's court, truth was a political afterthought. When her past began unraveling, it did so with theatrical precision. A servant spilled a rumor. A courtier whispered to Cranmer. Suddenly, everyone who had ever shared a wink or a memory with Catherine was being interrogated. Lovers became liabilities, confidants became snitches, and Henry, humiliated, betrayed, and probably nursing another infected leg, fell into a righteous rage. Catherine was arrested. Not for being disloyal per se, but for having been someone before she was his. She was charged with unchastity before marriage, a Tudor way of saying, you were supposed to be a blank page, and instead, you were a diary. They executed her in 1542. She was still a teenager. Of course, modern historians revisit her story with a more skeptical lens. Was she a predator or prey? Was she a flirt or a girl trapped in a cage built from politics and desire? Tudor morality would have you believe she was both villain and fool. But the fact remains, the men who ruined her got promotions. And Catherine became a cautionary tale recited by queens who followed her down the aisle. The irony? Henry built her a private chapel, once. Claimed he loved her more than all the others, which just goes to show, nothing terrifies power like a girl with a past and a face worth remembering. But if Catherine was the rose that pricked too deep, then what do we make of a queen whose passions threatened the entire Scottish crown? After all, Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't just love unwisely, she loved explosively. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots. In the Great Hall of European Scandal, Mary, Queen of Scots, never needed an invitation. She was the drama. Not merely a queen, but a walking contradiction of Catholic virtue and reckless romanticism. She ruled Scotland as if it were a stage set for heartbreak and betrayal. Born with a crown and raised in the decadence of the French court, she returned to the stormy chaos of Scotland as a widow at 18, and with something far more dangerous than political ambition. A hunger for intimacy that defied her advisors, her enemies, and occasionally, common sense. They called her beautiful, too beautiful even. The kind of beauty that makes men foolish and women strategic. And Mary seemed to understand this. She used charm as both shield and sword, knowing full well that in a country where the nobles were armed, suspicious, and mostly Protestant, her power rested more in hearts than in laws. Her second marriage was to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Handsome, yes. Intelligent? Less so. Ambitious? Tragically. Their union began as a romantic coup and ended as a political farce, with Darnley drunk on ego and Mary trapped in the marital equivalent of a hostage situation. He was jealous, erratic, and by all accounts, insecure in the way that only a man overshadowed by his wife's authority could be. He wanted power. She wanted stability. They got neither. Then came the third man, the infamous James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. A warlord with a taste for forceful persuasion and political brinkmanship, he arrived in Mary's life like a storm in armor. Whether she was seduced, coerced, or simply out of options is still debated, but what followed was pure chaos. Darnley was found dead under mysterious circumstances, strangled after surviving a house explosion, because Scotland never did subtlety well. Rumors swirled like crows. Did Mary orchestrate it? Did Bothwell? Did she know and choose silence over scandal? The lines blurred fast. Within months, she married Bothwell. Yes, the likely murderer of her second husband. Yes, that fast. Historians have argued for centuries over the psychological gymnastics required for such a move. Some say trauma. Some say politics. Others suggest a deeper obsession, an uncontrollable compulsion toward men who embodied danger, power, and ruin. The Scottish nobles had seen enough. Mary was imprisoned, overthrown, and eventually fled to England seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. What she got instead was 19 years of imprisonment, and, ultimately, execution. Officially, she was killed for treason. Unofficially, she was eliminated for being too seductive, too Catholic, and too unpredictable to be allowed near power ever again. And what of her legacy? Depending on who's telling the story, she's either a tragic heroine or a femme fatale with a crown, a queen undone by love, or a woman who used love to undo everything around her. Her story has been told in ballads, plays, and bad historical dramas. Each one tweaks the romance, shifts the blame, softens the scandal. But the truth is less tidy. Mary loved with a kind of reckless momentum that seemed less about lust and more about defiance. In a world that demanded queens be quiet, chaste, and conveniently dull, she was none of the above, and that made her dangerous. But if Mary's scandal came wrapped in royal blood and murder plots, the woman who followed her on our list wore her sensuality like stage makeup, loud, exaggerated, and deeply offensive to the British elite. Because Queen Caroline of Brunswick didn't hide her appetites. She paraded them through Europe. If you're fascinated by the hidden lives of queens and princesses, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the rest of our journey through history's most scandalous royals. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Whether it's a quiet evening in London or the middle of the night in New York, we want to know who's keeping company with these royal secrets. 3. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Queen Caroline of Brunswick was the kind of royal who turned every room into a political battlefield without ever meaning to. She didn't have to conspire or scheme. She simply had to exist in her particular, unpolished way, and the British establishment would combust on its own. If Catherine Howard was the doomed ingenue and Mary, Queen of Scots, the tragic romantic cyclone, Caroline was something far more bewildering to the monarchy, a woman who refused to be embarrassed. When she arrived in Britain to marry the future George IV, the court reacted as though someone had opened a window during a performance, shocked, offended, and vaguely allergic. Caroline was loud, affectionate, unrestrained, and utterly unaware of how to pretend otherwise. She hugged people. She laughed too loudly. She ate with enthusiasm. She asked personal questions with disarming sincerity. In the stiff choreography of British court life, she was a one-woman improvisational disaster. George IV took one look at her and reportedly fled the room. Not metaphorically, he literally left. Their marriage was doomed by hour one. He considered her uncouth. She considered him pretentious. He drank heavily. She spoke her mind. It was a mismatch made in political heaven and personal hell. Soon enough the couple separated, leaving Caroline effectively banished from the innermost circles of power. Instead of sulking in lonely English estates, she did something far more scandalous. She traveled, and not with the icy dignity expected of an estranged royal consort. No, Caroline embraced the wide world with all the curiosity of a rebellious teenager on gap year. She danced in Italian villas. She entertained artists and minor nobles. She enjoyed theatrically flirtatious banter that made British ambassadors write panicked letters home. Satirists adored her. They printed cartoons depicting her indulging in continental liberties. A wonderfully vague euphemism that allowed the public imagination to run wild without crossing into legal danger. Politicians used her reputation as a cudgel to attack her husband, and her husband used it to justify cutting her off financially. She became both weapon and target. Her household abroad became the stuff of gossip. Servants insisted they saw nothing improper. Enemies insisted they saw everything improper. Visitors wrote letters hinting at a free-spirited atmosphere. The truth, as usual, lived somewhere in the fog between political agenda and personal eccentricity. By the time George IV became king, he was determined to prevent Caroline from becoming queen. He invoked the Pains and Penalties Bill, essentially putting her on trial before Parliament for immorality, a word broad enough to fit any accusation and conveniently impossible to disprove. Crowds gathered to support her, waving banners and shouting insults at the king. For once, Caroline was Britain's unexpected working-class hero, a messy, outspoken woman standing up to an overstuffed monarch. She won public sympathy but lost the war. She was barred from George's coronation and died a year later, exhausted, unwell, and still very much herself, unapologetic to the last. Looking back, Caroline wasn't dangerous in the moral sense. She was dangerous in the social sense. In an age obsessed with decorum, she treated propriety like optional seasoning. Her rumored indulgences, theatrically affectionate behavior, and fondness for flirtatious spectacle were less sins than statements. She challenged the monarchy simply by being unfiltered. But if her romantic chaos rattled Britain from afar, the next woman on the list rattled England from the throne's very edge. Princess Margaret, the royal who turned every indulgence into a headline and every headline into a scandalous myth. 4. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. Princess Margaret never ruled a kingdom, but she ruled every room she entered, and often left it more scandalized than she found it. She was the Queen's younger sister, but rarely anyone's second act. Born into privilege, but always aching for something more primal, more theatrical, more forbidden. If Britain expected royalty to behave like porcelain, delicate, untouchable, slightly dead behind the eyes, Margaret preferred to behave like fine crystal, brilliant, breakable, and designed to sing when struck. She was, from the beginning, a problem. Not a criminal one, never that, but a social one, which in royal circles is often worse. Too beautiful to be ignored, too witty to be silenced, too confident to be pitied. The press called her glamorous. Her friends called her complicated. Her staff, in whispered tones, often called her impossible. And for much of her life, she wore all three reputations like expensive perfume, noticeable from a distance, intoxicating up close. Margaret's love life was less a series of relationships and more a collection of small rebellions. The most infamous, of course, was her entanglement with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man with a clean jawline and an even cleaner military record. The romance bloomed in a post-war Britain desperate for decorum, and Margaret, in predictable defiance, fell in love with someone she legally couldn't marry without renouncing her royal rights. The press exploded. The church balked. Parliament sighed. The Queen paused. Ultimately, Margaret chose the crown over the man, or perhaps she was forced to choose, and history just polished the heartbreak into loyalty. Either way, the sacrifice only sharpened her edges. What followed were years of whispered parties, dazzling affairs, and emotional crossfires that the press could barely keep up with. Margaret didn't just date, she performed romance. Her lovers included actors, artists, aristocrats, men with talent, daring, or at the very least, excellent tailoring. Some described her desires as thrill-seeking, others as deeply performative. There were whispers of secret rendezvous on Caribbean beaches, of wild nights behind palace doors, of romantic obsessions that burned fast and left ash in their wake. What's notable is not whether these stories were true, but how often they were believed. Margaret, after all, looked like the kind of woman who might behave scandalously, and in royal life, appearance is 9/10 of guilt. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Earl of Snowdon, was perhaps inevitable. A royal aesthete drawn to a commoner artist. They were magnetic, dysfunctional, wildly photogenic. He took intimate portraits. She gave him access to a world most photographers only dream of. The union spiraled in a blur of affairs, artistic ambition, and mutual resentment. By the time they divorced, both had rewritten the script on royal marriage, with Margaret playing the role of tragic muse and dangerous rebel all at once. What makes Margaret so enduringly fascinating is not just that she pushed boundaries, but that she seemed to need boundaries in order to push against them. Her reputation for extravagant parties, emotionally intense affairs, and reckless romantic choices wasn't just a lifestyle. It was a kind of existential protest. Against duty, against boredom, against invisibility. She drank, she danced, she flirted with consequences. And in doing so, she became something terrifying to the establishment. A woman with power who used it for pleasure. But if Margaret's scandals were modern, personal, and media-drenched, the next royal on our list comes from a darker, dustier chapter of history, one where passion and politics blurred into something far more medieval. Meet Queen Isabella of Angoulême, whose reputation for excessive desire haunted the chronicles like perfume in a crypt. 5. Queen Isabella of Angoulême. Isabella of Angoulême entered English royal history like a thunderstorm arriving at a picnic, dramatic, poorly timed, and destined to ruin everyone's plans. She was just 12 years old when she became Queen of England, which in itself says more about medieval marriage politics than any footnote ever could. Her groom? King John, known for losing Normandy, provoking the barons into open revolt, and dying in historical obscurity right before the Magna Carta could make him more interesting. A man so widely disliked he was nicknamed John Softsword, and not because of his fencing technique. Isabella, however, was anything but soft. Though cloaked in the limitations of medieval womanhood, she would become one of those rare queens whose personal life refused to stay in the shadows. From the beginning, her marriage was laced with political tension. John had essentially stolen her from a rival noble house, breaking off her betrothal to the Lusignans in an act of royal impulse. This sparked a continental feud, which Isabella's own family never quite forgot. As queen, Isabella was young, yes, but never passive. Chroniclers took notice. Some described her as beautiful, calculating, and unusually assertive. Others, less generous, called her nemus lasciva, a Latin phrase meaning excessively wanton, or in the polite English of modern historians, scandalously intense in her romantic expression. What did that actually mean? No one quite agrees. But in an era when queens were expected to be dignified parchment scrolls, unread, untouched, and completely preserved, Isabella was described like a work of forbidden poetry. She gave birth to 5 children with John, which for a medieval queen was practically a job requirement. But it was her afterlife, the years following John's death, that truly lit up the rumor mill. Widowed at just 21, Isabella returned to France and married Hugh X of Lusignan. Yes, from the same family John had insulted years before. The marriage wasn't just romantic, it was defiant. Politically loaded, reputationally explosive, and driven, some said, by passions Isabella had been forced to contain for too long. Their union produced 9 more children. Isabella was, by any metric, prolific. But again, it wasn't the childbearing that scandalized. It was the whispers of her boldness. She was accused of manipulating church property. She fought aggressively for her children's inheritance. She was said to dominate her husband politically, all rare and suspicious behavior for a woman of her time, and thus swiftly translated into character assassination. The chroniclers, almost all male and usually clerics, turned her confidence into lust, her assertiveness into sin, her strategic thinking into sexual deviance. By the end of her life, Isabella was portrayed as a kind of medieval siren, beautiful, proud, and too dangerously passionate for the orderly world of kings and abbots. Even in death, her name lingered in church documents as a warning, a caution, a curiosity. What survives of her, beyond the embellished slander, is the silhouette of a queen who dared to want. Not quietly, not apologetically, but with the unblinking gaze of someone who knew exactly how power worked and how desire could be mistaken for rebellion. And yet, compared to the next queen, the one who played romantic theater as if directing a private opera, Isabella's legend feels almost restrained. Because Henrietta Maria of France didn't just inspire scandal, she staged it. 6. Henrietta Maria of France. If ever a queen seemed designed to offend every delicate English sensibility at once, it was Henrietta Maria of France. A Catholic princess dropped into a Protestant kingdom. A French woman set loose in the stiff-lipped court of Charles I. A lover of elaborate rituals, excessive stagecraft, and emotionally immersive romance dramas. Henrietta wasn't just incompatible with England. She was the embodiment of everything England feared might be too French. When she arrived in 1625, 17 years old and sparkling with Bourbon flair, English courtiers braced themselves. She spoke little English, kept a French household, and traveled with an entourage more fit for Versailles than Whitehall. But most scandalous of all, she brought with her a theatrical, almost liturgical style of affection. Ornate, performative, and, to the English, unsettlingly personal. Henrietta Maria's romantic expression wasn't scandalous by modern standards, it was scandalous by Puritan standards. And in 17th century England, that was enough to warrant volumes of pamphlets, satirical plays, and breathless sermons. She called Charles her dearest heart, wrote letters dripping with metaphoric devotion, and engaged in displays of emotional intensity that alarmed the country's Protestant establishment. At one point she was accused, seriously, of attempting to Catholicize the king through affection. Not legislation, not war, affection. Of course, these weren't the passions of scandalous affairs or illicit liaisons. They were something far more confusing. Domestic sensuality, made public. Henrietta Maria turned love into ceremony. She oversaw masques, ornate court entertainments filled with allegory and veiled symbolism, often casting herself as a goddess or virtuous heroine in allegorical romances. English conservatives winced. To them, her court was a theater of excess, too Italian, too Catholic, and altogether too emotional. She corresponded regularly with Charles, even when they lived under the same roof. Their love letters became minor epics. She gave him pet names. She wept theatrically at their partings. Rumors swirled that she rehearsed emotional scenes with her ladies-in-waiting, running over lines, gestures, and entrances like a queen preparing for a role. Her critics saw this as manipulative. Her defenders saw it as sincere. Either way, it unnerved the Protestant nobility, who equated romantic simplicity with virtue and anything more flamboyant with danger. To her enemies, Henrietta was a seductress, not in the lurid physical sense, but in the emotional one. She was accused of having overheated affections, of influencing Charles too deeply with her continental sensibilities. The idea that a wife could sway a king not through counsel, but through romantic pageantry, was a threat to the very Protestant masculine order. Her influence was said to be partly responsible for Charles's most fatal political miscalculations, especially his stubbornness, his divine right delusions, and his tragic detachment from public sentiment. Whether that's fair or not is debatable. But it's undeniable that Henrietta Maria was hated more for her style than her strategy. England, gripped by Puritanism and paranoia, saw her emotional extravagance as something bordering on spiritual corruption. When the English Civil War broke out, Henrietta fled. She raised funds and armies for her husband, wrote fervent letters of encouragement, and returned only briefly before exile took her for good. Charles would be executed. Henrietta would live out her days in France, surrounded by the familiar drama of royal exile and courtly intrigue. And yet, her legacy remains. A queen who made romance into ritual and ritual into power, who wielded affection not like a secret, but like a torch, and who showed that in royal politics, sometimes the most provocative scandal is a love too loud to be ignored. But if Henrietta Maria was accused of overacting in matters of the heart, her successor in mystery was accused of something even more dangerous: loving too quietly, too secretly, and perhaps too intimately. Queen Anne's whispers were never shouted, but they echoed. 7. Queen Anne, Stuart. If Queen Anne had a scandal, it whispered, rather than roared. Her reign, often painted in muted tones, poor health, political paralysis, a kingdom teetering on the edge of modernity, was, beneath the surface, riddled with a slow-burn intimacy that refused to fit neatly into the moral boxes of her time. No explosions, no lovers leaping from balconies, just letters, long, emotional, suspiciously tender letters, and glances, and silences, and the endless layered speculation that came with a queen who seemed far more emotionally invested in her ladies than her own husband. Anne ruled from 1702 to 1714, a monarch often overshadowed by the wars and wigs of her time. But behind the military victories and parliamentary battles was a personal life marked by deep, sometimes overwhelming, attachments to her female courtiers, attachments that defied the social grammar of platonic affection. Chief among these was Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Intelligent, bold, politically astute, and utterly unimpressed by royal etiquette, Sarah became Anne's closest friend, fiercest critic, and emotional lightning rod. The two exchanged letters that read less like correspondence between queen and courtier and more like the aching prose of a relationship straining under the weight of both dependence and desire. Anne wrote of missing Sarah's company, longing for her words, feeling wounded by her silences. Sarah, in return, seemed to know exactly how to manipulate the dynamics, offering affection when it suited her, withholding it when she needed leverage. Historians debate the nature of their bond. Was it romantic? Erotic? Merely the overblown intensity of a lonely woman raised in an age where same-sex friendships were florid by custom? The truth is maddeningly elusive, and perhaps that's the point. It's not about what was, but what couldn't be proven. Eventually, the friendship curdled. Sarah's ambition outpaced Anne's tolerance. The queen, wounded and humiliated, replaced her with Abigail Masham, quieter, gentler, less politically threatening, but no less controversial. Abigail, too, became the object of Anne's intense affection, setting off another wave of whispers. Sarah, ever vindictive, accused the queen of favoring Abigail in ways that ought not to be named. The implication was clear, if conveniently unprovable. Anne denied everything, naturally. She was a devout Anglican, married unhappily to Prince George of Denmark and plagued by ill health. She had suffered at least 17 pregnancies, none of which resulted in a surviving heir. Her body was in constant decline. Her court was a battlefield of factions. She had very little time or energy for illicit drama. And yet, the rumors clung to her legacy like perfume in a locked drawer, never seen, but never forgotten. Even after death, Anne's emotional life became the subject of speculation. Playwrights, poets, and historians have returned, again and again, to those letters. To the intimacy she allowed only in ink. To the way her affections seemed to center not on men, but on women who understood her isolation. Queens, after all, rarely get to have ordinary friendships. And Anne's were anything but ordinary. If Henrietta Maria turned romance into theater, Anne turned it into subtext. A slow, quiet rebellion against the rigid expectations of female propriety. One that left no explicit scandal, but a lingering trail of emotional contradictions and court gossip no one could quite silence. And yet, Anne's whispered passions pale in comparison to the next woman, whose carefully staged flirtations weren't whispers at all. Because when Elizabeth I entered a room, she didn't ask for devotion. She demanded it. 8. Elizabeth I. Elizabeth didn't need lovers to provoke scandal. She only needed silence, a sideways glance, and the calculated flick of a fan. Where her sister Mary was feared for her fire and her cousin Mary of Scots condemned for her recklessness, Elizabeth was a fortress wrapped in velvet. She built her power on a paradox, a queen who made herself untouchable, and yet never stopped playing with the idea of being touched. She never married. This fact alone transformed her into one of the most enduring riddles of royal history. A reigning monarch in a patriarchal world, Elizabeth was expected, required, to marry. Instead, she turned down suitor after suitor with a blend of flirtation, diplomacy, and maddening ambiguity. Kings, dukes, and emperors danced attendance, offering treaties dressed up as proposals. Elizabeth, in return, offered nothing but the promise of maybe, a tactic that kept Europe guessing and England free from foreign husbands. But for all her refusals, Elizabeth's court was anything but cold. Her relationships with her male favorites were the stuff of legend, court poetry, and jealous rage. Chief among them was Robert Dudley, the dashing Earl of Leicester. Childhood friend, longtime companion, and, depending on which ambassador you read, possibly something more. They spent hours alone. She gifted him rooms next to her own. He called her by pet names in private. His wife died under suspicious circumstances, her body found at the bottom of a staircase, an event that added a permanent shadow to Dudley's name and fed the bonfire of gossip surrounding their bond. Elizabeth never confirmed anything, nor did she deny it. Instead, she crafted an image of romantic power that was theatrical, chaste, and obsessively controlled. She surrounded herself with handsome young courtiers, promoting them based on charm as much as skill. They wrote her poems. She answered with cryptic praise. Some said she delighted in making them jealous of each other, pitting one man's devotion against another's. She was the eternal muse, the unreachable queen, the woman no one could have and everyone wanted. Foreign diplomats reported with increasing frustration that her court felt more like a stage than a government. Elizabeth flirted openly, strategically, with ambassadors, emissaries, and her own counselors. She once told Parliament that she was already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England. It was part devotion, part performance, and entirely effective. The Virgin Queen myth was born not from chastity, but from political genius wrapped in courtly rituals. Even in old age, Elizabeth played the role with precision. She wore layers of makeup, high collars, and ornate wigs to preserve her iconography. But beneath the costume was a woman whose emotional needs, attachments, and desires still stirred questions that no historian has quite answered. Did she love Dudley? Did she long for closeness but fear the consequences? Or did she simply understand that the appearance of desire, carefully curated, was more powerful than fulfillment? Elizabeth weaponized flirtation the way others wielded swords. And in doing so, she transformed romantic ambiguity into a tool of statecraft. Her power lay not in what she gave away, but in what she withheld: affection, confirmation, scandal, closure. But if Elizabeth ruled from a throne of aloof seduction, the next royal on our list tore straight through the aristocratic rulebook. Lady Caroline Lamb didn't just flirt with scandal. She choreographed it, turned it into performance art, and left high society gasping for breath. 9. Lady Caroline Lamb. Lady Caroline Lamb was never meant to be quiet. She was born into aristocracy, married into politics, and raised in the expectation that women of her rank should be dignified background characters. Elegant, well-read, slightly aloof, and always restrained. Caroline was all of those things, occasionally, but most of the time she was a walking contradiction in silk gloves, brilliant yet chaotic, witty yet unfiltered, romantic to the point of destruction, and entirely unbothered by the limits set for women of her station. By the time she crossed paths with Lord Byron, the romantic poet, celebrity libertine, and self-declared madman, Caroline had already grown disillusioned with conventional respectability. She was married to William Lamb, a man who would later become prime minister, and by all accounts was patient, dutiful, and disastrously boring. Caroline wanted more than dinner parties and political speeches. She wanted intensity, obsession, madness. So when Byron walked in with his Byronic gloom and rakish smirk, she practically combusted. Their affair was short, toxic, and instantly legendary. She described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know, which would become his unofficial slogan, and arguably hers. For a brief moment they were inseparable, writing, arguing, composing letters drenched in theatrical declarations. Then Byron, true to form, grew bored and slipped away. Caroline, true to form, did not. She pursued him, publicly, repeatedly, with flair. She sent him letters, followed him to parties, cut off locks of her own hair to send as keepsakes. At one particularly famous event, she allegedly attempted to confront him dressed in men's clothing, a detail which may or may not be true, but feels accurate to her emotional style. Dramatic, unbound by norms, and unconcerned with judgment. Caroline's obsession with Byron wasn't merely romantic, it was performative, poetic, and, to many observers, disturbingly erotic by the standards of Regency England. Women were supposed to suffer love in silence. Caroline turned her suffering into a stage play. She wrote a novel, Glenarvan, a thinly veiled revenge fantasy, in which Byron was cast as a villainous seducer, and she as the tragic heroine. It was read in private by every scandal-hungry aristocrat in London and publicly denounced by all of them, including her own family. Her behavior scandalized high society not because it was immoral, but because it was active. Women were allowed to be ruined. They weren't allowed to announce it. Caroline's refusal to be discreet made her dangerous. She mocked the rules by breaking them too loudly. And while many chalked her descent into instability to emotional fragility, it's hard to ignore how much her punishment was linked not to her feelings, but to her visibility. She was eventually pushed to the margins of polite society. Her marriage collapsed. Her health declined. And yet, even in exile, she remained a figure of tragic fascination. A woman whose desire refused to be domesticated, who wrote herself into infamy, and who chased emotional chaos with the same determination most people reserve for ambition. Lady Caroline Lamb didn't just misbehave, she authored her misbehavior. And in doing so, she exposed the fragile machinery of aristocratic morality, a system terrified of women who loved too visibly, too loudly, and on their own terms. But if Caroline danced too close to the fire of public obsession, the next royal flirted with rebellion from behind a curtain of lace and loyalty. Princess Louise, daughter of Queen Victoria, didn't look like a rule breaker until you looked closer. 10. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Princess Louise was Queen Victoria's sixth child, and from the moment she could speak, she seemed determined not to be swallowed by the dark velvet drapes of royal conformity. While her siblings either obeyed or quietly rebelled under the weight of duty, Louise carved her own lane entirely, through art, politics, and as the whispers went, a tangled network of unconventional relationships that defied Victorian expectations like a well-placed ink stain on a white glove. On paper, she was everything a princess should be: elegant, artistic, intelligent, and devoted to her country. But off paper, off the record, behind the palace walls, she was something far more complicated. Louise was not content with mere needlepoint and small talk. She sculpted, publicly, professionally. She trained at the National Art Training School and took commissions. Not decorative baubles for drawing rooms, but serious works of portraiture and public art, including a statue of Queen Victoria herself that still stands in Kensington Gardens. This, in itself, was nearly scandalous. Royal women were supposed to dabble, not create. Art was a hobby, not a vocation. But Louise wasn't interested in hobbies. She was interested in meaning, and people, and freedom. She moved through artistic and intellectual circles that were considered shockingly bohemian for a daughter of the empire. She formed friendships with actors, writers, and sculptors who had no titles but plenty of ideas. Her studio became a world apart from the moral iron cage of Buckingham Palace. And then there were the rumors, the ones that trailed her like expensive perfume, that she had fallen in love with her sculpting instructor, Joseph Edgar Boom, a man not only beneath her station but married, that she may have had an affair with him, that their relationship went beyond mentorship and into something far less permissible. He died suddenly, and speculation immediately erupted that he had passed away during a secret visit to her studio. The palace, of course, denied everything, but denials in the royal court often arrive a few days too late, and always sound too specific. There were other whispers, of entanglements with other men, of romantic attachments that were improper, unofficial, or inconsistent with royal dignity, of a possible child born in secret and placed into adoption, unconfirmed but persistent. Louise, for her part, never admitted to anything, but she never fully distanced herself from the accusations either. She simply carried on, charming, confident, and infuriatingly modern. Her eventual marriage to John Campbell, Marquess of Lorne, later Duke of Argyll, was another rebellion, though one dressed up as compromise. He was a commoner by royal standards, but intellectually respected. Their marriage was distant, sometimes affectionate, often strained. The lack of children sparked its own rumors, the lack of public warmth even more. Some whispered about incompatibility. Others went further, suggesting the marriage was one of convenience to mask deeper truths. What makes Princess Louise fascinating isn't what we can prove. It's what persists in shadow. She moved through life like a woman balancing two contradictory worlds, one of royal expectations and one of personal independence. And though she never publicly scandalized the monarchy, she privately unnerved it. She didn't explode convention. She wore it down, piece by elegant piece. But if Louise tested the limits of Victorian restraint with intellect and art, her mother, Queen Victoria herself, shocked history in a quieter, far more unsettling way, by loving too deeply, too physically, and too humanly for the throne she sat upon. 11. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is not usually the name that comes to mind when whispers of unorthodox romantic appetites arise. She is history's eternal matron in black, stern, mourning, a granite statue of imperial dignity. But the irony of her image is that beneath the stiff silhouette of moral authority lived a woman consumed not by duty alone, but by an overwhelming, almost obsessive passion. Her reign gave us the phrase Victorian values, but her private life quietly steamrolled over many of them. She met Prince Albert when she was 17. He was her cousin, a detail that barely raised a royal eyebrow in the 19th century, and from the beginning she made no secret of her desire to be with him. In fact, she proposed to him, a reversal of roles that might seem progressive until you remember that she was queen, and queens rarely waited on permission. Their marriage was, by royal standards, unusually affectionate. Actually, by any standards, it was emotionally volcanic. Victoria adored Albert. Publicly, she presented him as her consort, her advisor, her equal. Privately, her letters and diaries revealed a woman so besotted that even her courtiers blushed. She described his beauty, his presence, and, without crossing into the inappropriate, his effect on her with an intensity that stunned Victorian sensibilities. She wrote of longing, of emotional dependence, and of nights spent in his arms with the kind of fervor more common in romantic poetry than in royal memoirs. Albert, in turn, shaped her world. He advised her on statecraft, reorganized the royal household, and made himself indispensable. But what seemed to others like a tidy domestic alliance often looked, from the inside, like an emotional monarchy within a monarchy. Victoria's passion for Albert wasn't just intense, it was total. She seemed to need him in a way that bordered on existential, and when he died in 1861, the edifice of her identity shattered. What followed was more than grief. It was a public consecration of personal loss. She dressed in mourning for the remaining 40 years of her life. She refused to appear in public, avoided ceremonial duties, and effectively recast the monarchy as a shrine to lost love. Her obsession with Albert didn't fade. It calcified into ritual. She kept his rooms exactly as they were. She demanded that his shaving water be prepared every morning, as if he might return. This wasn't etiquette. It was devotion transmuted into daily performance. Her courtiers were both touched and unnerved. The queen's mourning became its own kind of myth, a love so deep it rewrote the function of monarchy. And behind it, more rumors whispered. Her relationship with her Scottish servant John Brown caused eyebrows to lift across the empire. He was brusque, fiercely loyal, and always at her side. She called him darling, and in private correspondence, their bond seems to have tipped into an emotional closeness that made her family deeply uncomfortable. Later still, her friendship with her Indian servant Abdul Karim echoed a similar pattern. Deep trust, pet names, tokens of affection, and outrage from those who thought it unseemly. Was Victoria simply lonely? Or did her need for intimate attachment run deeper than anyone dared say aloud? Historians argue. The court flinched, but the letters remain, hinting at a queen whose desire for closeness overwhelmed even her legendary sense of duty. She was the empire's face of virtue, and yet she loved with a depth and hunger that scandalized those who served her. Which makes one wonder, what happens when seduction isn't scandalous because of what it is, but because of who it belongs to? That question haunted the legacy of Elizabeth Woodville, the next royal on our list, a woman whose charm was so potent, her enemies swore it had to be witchcraft. 12. Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville entered English royal history like a spell in motion, beautiful, calculating, and surrounded by rumors thick enough to drown a court. She was not born to be a queen. She had no royal blood, no high-born lineage, no powerful backers at court. What she had was presence and charm, and, if her enemies were to be believed, something darker, an uncanny ability to seduce a king and rearrange the political map with nothing more than her eyes and an inconveniently timed marriage. She was a Lancastrian widow when she met Edward IV, the charismatic Yorkist king who had recently taken the throne in the middle of the Wars of the Roses. By all accounts, their courtship was sudden and impulsive. They married in secret, without council approval, without alliances, without any of the careful orchestration that kept royal marriages locked into diplomatic function. It was, as far as anyone could tell, a love match. And that's precisely what made it dangerous. Elizabeth was beautiful. Everyone agreed on that. Tall, fair, elegant, and composed. But in the 15th century, beauty in a woman without noble background was often read not as a gift, but as a threat. Her swift rise from widow to queen consort triggered panic among the nobility, who had expected Edward to marry a foreign princess, not a commoner with 12 siblings and a reputation for ambitious social climbing. Almost immediately, Elizabeth was accused of using witchcraft to enchant the king. Chroniclers claimed she had lured him with charms and spells, that she bewitched him with her beauty, that he was not himself when he married her. None of these accusations were subtle. They were rooted in the belief that a woman like Elizabeth could not earn a crown. She could only manipulate one onto her head. And once there, she didn't waste time. Her large family was quickly elevated, married into power, granted titles, and set like pearls into the English aristocracy. The backlash was swift and venomous. Nobles bristled, courtiers plotted, and Elizabeth's reputation hardened into something legendary and divisive. The seductress queen, the sorceress social climber, the woman who turned marriage into conquest. Of course, there was no evidence of actual sorcery, but that hardly mattered. In medieval England, witchcraft was less about spells and more about disruption, a way to explain any woman who upset the natural order. And Elizabeth, with her common blood and queenly ambitions, had upset everything. Her mere presence on the throne was a scandal wrapped in perfume. Even after Edward's death, her legend didn't fade. She was blamed for political unrest, accused of manipulating her son's futures, and eventually forced into sanctuary when her enemies, led by Richard III, took the throne. Her sons, the infamous princes in the Tower, disappeared. The mystery of their fate would haunt England for centuries, and Elizabeth's enemies were all too ready to cast her as a mother who had meddled too far, loved too strategically, and grasped too greedily. And yet, through all the loss and slander, she endured. She outlived the king who had loved her, buried her sons, and saw her dynasty rise again through her daughter Elizabeth of York, who married Henry VII and united the warring houses. But the shadow of her ambition and the whispers of unnatural charms clung to her story. Because Elizabeth Woodville wasn't just a woman who married well. She was a woman who knew what she was doing. And in medieval England, that was often considered the darkest magic of all. But if Elizabeth's power lay in seductive calculation, the next queen on our list dared something even rarer. She dared to be assertive in love, in intellect, and in partnership. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, wasn't beheaded, but she didn't escape scandal either. 13. Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is often remembered as the one who survived. The sixth wife. The final chapter. The calm after Henry VIII's matrimonial storm. She is cast in popular memory as a sort of Tudor nursemaid, pious, patient, dutiful, a woman who knew how to keep her head down and her head on. But the real Catherine was far more layered, far more intelligent, and far more romantically subversive than the textbooks admit. In a court obsessed with obedience and control, Catherine dared to be emotionally autonomous, and that alone was dangerous. She had already buried 2 husbands before she caught the eye of the aging, temperamental king. At 31, she was older than most Tudor brides and far more experienced. She was also in love with someone else. Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, had already proposed to her. Catherine had accepted. But when the King of England declares himself your suitor, personal preference becomes a diplomatic inconvenience. So, she married Henry. She became queen. And from the outside, it all looked smooth. She played the role. She was gentle to his children, clever with his advisors, soothing to his ego. But behind the piety was a woman with a sharp theological mind, a progressive spirit and a romantic history far more assertive than the court dared speak aloud. She published books, under her own name, an act nearly unheard of for a woman at the time. One of them, Lamentation of a Sinner, outlined her personal journey of faith and her belief in grace through Scripture alone. A viewpoint suspiciously Protestant in a country still tipping between reform and reaction. The book was popular and controversial. It also made her enemies. Behind palace doors, her confidence unnerved the aging king. She engaged in theological debates with scholars and with Henry himself. She gathered a circle of like-minded reformists. It wasn't long before conservative factions at court began whispering that she was overstepping, perhaps even heretical. And in the Tudor world, heresy wasn't a private concern, it was a public death sentence. Henry, increasingly paranoid and physically decaying, signed an arrest warrant for her in secret. Had Catherine not discovered it, through a loyal ally, and scrambled to plead ignorance and submission in time, she might well have joined Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard on the executioner's block. She played the role of penitent wife flawlessly. Henry forgave her, or pretended to. The warrant disappeared, but the threat had been very real. When Henry died, Catherine finally got what she'd been denied years before, a marriage of her own choosing. She wed Thomas Seymour just months after the king's death. The court was scandalized by the haste. It was unseemly for a queen dowager to remarry so quickly, and to someone already suspected of ambition and opportunism. But Catherine did not care. She had waited long enough to choose her own partner. The irony? The love match that defined her independence also destroyed her peace. Their marriage was turbulent. Seymour was erratic and politically reckless. Catherine, pregnant and exhausted, died in childbirth less than a year later. She did not live to see Seymour's downfall or his execution for treason. What remains is the outline of a woman who played a dangerous game too well for comfort, a queen who balanced affection with intellect, devotion with defiance. Catherine Parr didn't flirt her way into history. She reasoned, debated, and outlived her rivals. And yet even she, the safe wife, couldn't escape the scandal machine of Tudor England. Because in a court where women were supposed to inspire love but never direct it, even a little romantic agency was enough to invite suspicion. And speaking of suspicion, the next name on our list never wore the crown, but her legacy was arguably more whispered about than her sister's. Mary Boleyn, beloved, beguiled, and persistently rumored, lived a life shaped not by power but by proximity to it. 14. Mary Boleyn. History tends to remember Mary Boleyn as a footnote in a far bloodier saga, a prelude, a prototype, the other Boleyn girl. But beneath the shadow of her infamous sister Anne, Mary lived a life that was tangled in rumor, charged with quiet scandal, and steeped in the kind of romantic mystery that Tudor chroniclers either ignored or exaggerated beyond recognition. She never wore a crown, never lost her head, and yet somehow she remains one of the most mythologized figures in the court of Henry VIII. Born into the ambitious Boleyn family, Mary was raised for one purpose: advancement. She was educated, attractive, and, critically, pliable in the eyes of those who saw daughters as political capital. Early in her life, she was sent to the glittering French court of Francis I, where young women of noble birth were expected to be ornaments, but not too ornamental. Mary, however, stood out. Reports from the French court described her as vivacious, engaging, and perhaps a little too willing to enjoy the attentions of powerful men. Whether she truly had affairs with members of the French nobility, including the king himself, remains uncertain, but the rumors stuck. By the time she returned to England, her reputation had preceded her. That didn't stop her from catching the eye of Henry VIII. Mary became his mistress, briefly, quietly, and with far less fanfare than the relationship that would later define her sister's fate. Still, the whispers were there. Did she bear him a child? 2? Was their connection serious or merely convenient? The answers remain speculative, But what's undeniable is that Mary was absorbed into the dangerous gravitational pull of the Tudor court's obsession with intimacy and legacy. Unlike Anne, who approached the throne through the careful choreography of courtly manipulation, Mary lacked political strategy. She didn't use her romantic entanglements to amass power. In fact, she seemed either disinterested or incapable of navigating the sharp edges of court intrigue. When her relationship with the king ended, so did her brief elevation in status. She married William Carey, a courtier of modest ambition, and settled into a quieter life, at least until Anne began her meteoric rise. Here, the drama truly deepened. While Anne captured the king's heart, Mary's personal choices began to cause embarrassment. Widowed, financially unstable, and lacking favor, she remarried, this time to a man far below her station. William Stafford, a soldier without title or influence. The match was romantic, unapproved, and ultimately scandalous. Mary was banished from court, cut off by her family, and relegated to the margins of royal society. But perhaps that is where the mystery of Mary Boleyn becomes most potent. She chose love, ordinary, unstrategic, inconvenient love, over politics, over court favor, over survival strategy. In a world where romantic entanglement was a weapon, Mary opted for sincerity, and for that, she was discarded. The question that lingers is not whether Mary was promiscuous or politically naive, but whether she understood something her sister never did, that in a court where women were praised for restraint but desired for availability, survival sometimes meant stepping away from power entirely. And yet, not all royal women chose retreat. Some leaned into the spectacle, fully, shamelessly, and with a smile that dared anyone to stop them. Enter Nell Gwynn, mistress, icon, and Restoration England's most outrageous royal flirt. 15. Nell Gwynn. Nell. Gwynn never wore a crown, never claimed a title higher than mistress, and yet she remains one of the most beloved and scandalous figures in British royal history. In a court full of political schemers and powdered whispers, Nell didn't whisper. She laughed, loudly, often, usually with a glass of wine in one hand and a devastating quip in the other. And somehow, she managed to become one of the most enduring companions of King Charles II. Not because she played by the rules, but because she absolutely refused to. Born into poverty, possibly in a brothel, possibly in a tavern, historians debate, but the options are equally telling. Nell's early life was not one of noble grooming or polished manners. She sold oranges at the theater before stepping onto the stage herself, quickly becoming known for her comic timing, expressive eyes, and ability to command attention like a born queen, albeit of a very different variety. Restoration. England was a bawdy, chaotic, and indulgent landscape, emerging from years of Puritan austerity with a vengeance. Charles II returned to the throne with an appetite for entertainment, art, and women. He was, to put it diplomatically, an enthusiastic participant in the romantic possibilities of monarchy, and Nell, with her razor wit and magnetic charm, caught his eye in a way no noblewoman ever could. What set Nell apart was not just that she was one of Charles's many mistresses, it was that she embraced it. She didn't hide behind lace curtains or orchestrate silent power plays. She was seen in public. She joked openly about her role, and she maintained a level of visibility that drove the aristocracy mad. She called herself the Protestant whore, a jab at her Catholic rivals for the king's affection. The phrase stuck, and so did the affection of the English people, who found her both scandalous and oddly refreshing. Unlike many royal mistresses, Nell didn't push for titles or interfere in politics. She didn't try to reshape the court in her image. What she did demand, loudly, consistently, was legitimacy and comfort for her children. She had 2 sons with Charles, and while only one survived, she fought hard to secure his place and inheritance. Her negotiations weren't subtle, but they were strategic and effective. Her surviving son, Charles Beauclerk, was made Duke of St. Albans. Nell's reputation wasn't built on refinement. It was built on presence. She was bawdy, yes, unfiltered, often, but also fiercely intelligent, emotionally sharp, and perfectly aware of the game she was playing. She made people laugh, but more importantly, she made the monarchy human again, at least for a moment. And she did it without shame. When she died in 1687, she left behind no crown, no memoir, no palace. What she left behind was a legend, the orange girl who became the king's favorite, not by silencing herself, but by being louder than anyone else. In a world that rewarded quiet, compliance, she was a walking refusal. But while Nell Gwyn played scandal for sport, the next royal on our list had her reputation sculpted for her, carved by enemies who believed her very bloodline made her dangerous. Because when Elizabeth of York smiled at a king, people saw seduction. When she bore one, they saw sorcery. 16. Queen Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York occupies a strangely quiet place in the roaring saga of English monarchy, a queen consort without controversy, a mother without scandal, a symbol of peace after decades of civil war. Or so the story goes. But history, with its selective memory and tendency to file women into neat categories, often confuses silence for simplicity. And Elizabeth was never simple. Beneath the gold-threaded veil of reconciliation, her life was shaped by rumor, shadowed by suspicion, and haunted by whispers of unnatural allure that, while absurd, reveal just how threatening her presence truly was. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV, a queen accused of sorcery and a king accused of seduction. That bloodline alone was enough to alarm a kingdom desperate for order. After the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth represented more than just Yorkist legitimacy. She embodied political resolution in female form. When Henry VII took the throne after defeating Richard III, he married Elizabeth to unify the warring houses and create the Tudor dynasty. The marriage was hailed as the triumph of diplomacy over bloodshed. But the myths began before the wedding dress was stitched. Before Henry claimed his throne, there were rumors that Elizabeth had been intended to marry Richard III, her own uncle. Whether Richard entertained this idea or not is still debated, but the mere suggestion was enough to ignite scandal. After all, Elizabeth was young, beautiful, and royal, three qualities that made her both desirable and politically dangerous. Chronicles of the time hint at an affectionate relationship between the two, though always with just enough ambiguity to keep future historians gnawing at the edges. And once she became queen, Elizabeth did something both expected and somehow unsettling. She bore heirs. Multiple. She fulfilled her duty with a quiet intensity that defied the image of the passive consort. Her fertility, always a royal obsession, was praised and scrutinized in equal measure. Some called it miraculous. Others called it suspicious. A few, more superstitious, whispered that she had inherited her mother's witchcraft, a word that conveniently explained any woman who succeeded too well at being both powerful and pleasing. In some circles she was said to have Yorkist hot blood, a phrase that straddled the line between medical theory and moral accusation. It implied passion, ambition, and appetite, traits not traditionally welcome in queens unless carefully disguised. Elizabeth, of course, never provided public evidence of anything unseemly. She was dutiful, pious, graceful, but none of that stopped the murmurs, especially not when she continued to secure the Tudor line with a kind of quiet competence that left little room for failure or excuses. She died young, just 37, after giving birth to her last daughter. Henry VII never remarried. Some say he was heartbroken. Others say he feared the loss of the Yorkist claim her body had helped solidify. Either way, her legacy was locked inside the Tudor mythos. The mother of Henry VIII, grandmother of Elizabeth I, and the queen who made peace look effortless. But effortlessness is often an illusion. And for a woman to be admired, desired, and politically essential was, in Tudor England, enough to earn a reputation she never asked for. Yet if Elizabeth's mystery lay in her restraint, the next royal wielded her passions like a sword. Margaret Tudor didn't just marry kings, she outlived them, remarried wildly, and loved in ways that sent royal advisors into fits of panic. 17. Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII and Queen Consort of Scotland, lived a life that should have been simple. She was married off at 13, given a crown to keep the peace between warring kingdoms, and expected to produce heirs while smiling politely through political purgatory. But Margaret was not a symbol. She was not quiet. And she was certainly not interested in playing the role of decorative diplomatic offering. Instead, she became one of the most emotionally volatile and romantically defiant royals of her era, so much so that even her own allies didn't know whether to trust her or sedate her. Her first marriage was to James IV of Scotland, a charming, cultured warrior king who, unlike his English in-laws, understood the value of both poetry and military campaign. Their union was celebrated across Britain as a gesture of reconciliation. It lasted just 10 years. James was killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, fighting against Margaret's own brother's forces. She was widowed at 23, with a child heir on the throne and an entire nation ready to tear itself apart over the regency. What followed was a series of decisions so politically questionable and emotionally chaotic that her legacy became permanently tattooed with rumors of restless passions. Less than a year after her husband's death, Margaret secretly married Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, a bold, handsome nobleman whose loyalty to Margaret was rivaled only by his loyalty to his own ambition. The Scottish nobility was appalled. So was England. The move was seen as impulsive at best, treacherous at worst. She lost the regency. She lost custody of her son. And she gained something even more dangerous, a reputation. The marriage to Angus quickly devolved into mistrust and betrayal. Margaret accused him of infidelity, cruelty, and treason. He accused her of manipulation and political scheming. Eventually she fled, pregnant and penniless, back to England. Then she returned to Scotland. Then she tried to have the marriage annulled. Then she tried to reconcile. It was an emotional seesaw that fed court gossip like raw meat. But Margaret wasn't done. In her 40s, she married a third time, this time to Henry Stuart, a man with little political standing but enough charm to convince Margaret to roll the dice again. This marriage also spiraled into bitterness. Margaret accused him of financial exploitation and personal betrayal. Still, she refused to fade into irrelevance. She involved herself in regency councils, negotiated between England and Scotland, and tried, against all odds, to broker peace between her feuding sons and factions. Through it all, Margaret was viewed with a wary mix of awe and contempt. Her political influence rose and fell with her romances, which made her dangerous in a way male rulers never were. Every romantic decision she made, whether driven by love, desperation, or strategy, was interpreted as moral weakness. Chroniclers painted her as impulsive, overly emotional, and indecently persistent in love, as if repeated heartbreak were proof of character flaw rather than consequence. But perhaps that was Margaret's true scandal. Not that she loved too much, but that she loved without apologizing. She was a queen who refused to live quietly, a woman who married and remarried not for dynastic calculation, but, seemingly, for herself. And if Margaret's desires turned kingdoms against her, the next royal on our list defied the system even more ruthlessly. Because Joan of Kent didn't just chase love, she broke laws to have it. 18. Joan of Kent. Joan of Kent, known in her own time as the Fair Maid of Kent, was not a woman who waited for permission. Born into Plantagenet blood, raised amid the political chaos of the 14th century, and entangled in more legal romantic drama than a Tudor courtier with a quill and a grudge, Joan wasn't simply a beauty of legend. She was a disruptor of dynastic expectation. Her greatest scandal: she fell in love with the wrong man. then married him, secretly, then married another man, also secretly, and then refused to undo either. In a period when noble women were chess pieces on a blood-soaked board, Joan started kicking over kings. Her first secret marriage was to Thomas Holland, a low-ranking knight of considerable charm and possibly more ambition than discretion. Joan was around 12 when the two supposedly married, or pledged themselves in a binding contract, depending on which version you prefer. Holland then left for a military campaign, and while he was off fighting in France, Joan's family quietly arranged a second marriage for her, this time to William Montague, the future Earl of Salisbury. Wealthier, higher status, more politically convenient, and utterly unaware that his new bride was already spoken for. When Holland returned to England, he found Joan married to someone else. Rather than slinking off into romantic failure, he petitioned the papal court to recognize his prior union as valid. Joan supported him, publicly, repeatedly, which to a medieval audience was equal parts courageous and morally ambiguous. After all, she had been living with her second husband. There were no public accusations, no scandals of flesh. But the optics were clear. This was a woman who had defied her family, her station, and the church, all in the name of love. The Pope eventually ruled in Holland's favor, invalidating Joan's second marriage. She returned to him, reclaiming her first husband and, along with him, a permanently complicated reputation. They had 4 children, and for a brief time, Joan's life settled into something approaching respectability. Until fate tossed her another curveball. Thomas died. Enter Edward, the Black Prince. Son of Edward III, heir to the throne, and one of the most celebrated warriors of the era. He had known Joan since childhood, and whether through destiny or sheer royal prerogative, he wanted her as his wife. The court was aghast. Joan was a widow with a complicated past, a woman whose previous romantic entanglements had been so chaotic they'd required papal arbitration. Hardly the ideal future Princess of Wales. They married anyway. The union shocked polite society and thrilled the gossip chroniclers. She bore him 2 sons, one of whom would become King Richard II. And yet, even as the mother of a future monarch, Joan's legacy remained colored by her early decisions. Some admired her as a woman who followed her heart. Others condemned her as impulsive, ungovernable, or even dangerously seductive. Her beauty was legendary, but so was her resolve. And in a century where female agency was often mistaken for moral corruption, that made her unforgettable. Joan didn't wield armies. She didn't rule in her own right. But through sheer will and a series of dangerous romantic choices, she reshaped her fate and secured her place in the royal bloodstream. Still, if Joan of Kent mastered the art of bending the rules for love, the next queen twisted them into a legend. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just push against the boundaries of royal desire. She built a reputation so vast, so layered in myth, that it became impossible to tell where the woman ended and the scandal began. 19. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't born to fit into anyone's story. She was born to rewrite the whole manuscript. One of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most elusive women of the 12th century, she was a duchess in her own right. A queen of 2 different kingdoms, a crusader, a political prisoner, and, depending on which chronicler you read, the medieval embodiment of every male anxiety about female power and appetite, rolled into one velvet-wrapped enigma. From the moment she inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, Eleanor became a prize, and a problem. Her first marriage was to Louis VII of France, a deeply religious king with the temperament of a monk and the libido of a stone statue. Eleanor, on the other hand, was Aquitanian through and through, raised in a court steeped in chivalry, poetry, sensuality, and a peculiar cultural invention called fin amour. Refined love, often more intense in its emotional and intellectual bonds than anything happening in the royal bedroom. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, which turned out to be less of a holy mission and more of a disastrous couple's vacation through hostile territory. Along the way, rumors began to bloom. That Eleanor had dressed in Amazonian garb, that she spent too much time with her uncle Raymond of Antioch, that her presence sowed disorder among the Crusaders. None of it was proven. All of it was repeated. By the time the crusade ended, so had the royal marriage. She divorced Louis on the official grounds of consanguinity, a favorite medieval escape hatch. But the real reason was likely less ecclesiastical and more personal. She was tired of being a nun with a crown. 2 months later, barely time to unpack, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, who would soon become Henry II of England. He was 10 years her junior, politically ambitious, intellectually brilliant, and at least for a while, passionately devoted to her. Their marriage produced 8 children and a few decades worth of drama. Henry was volatile. Eleanor was proud. They clashed as often as they conspired. At one point, she supported her sons in a rebellion against their father, which earned her nearly 16 years under various forms of house arrest. Still, she outlasted him. She outlived him. She outmaneuvered nearly every man who tried to sideline her. But it's not just her politics that fascinated and terrified her contemporaries. It was her reputation for romantic power. Troubadours sang of her beauty and her intellect. Some said she held courts of love in Aquitaine where women judged the merits of romantic arguments and defined the rules of affection. While the historical accuracy of these events is debated, the idea alone was revolutionary. A woman not just participating in, but governing love. Chroniclers accused her of being too bold, too sensual, too intellectually curious. One even claimed she had bewitched kings, not through sorcery, but through sheer charisma. For a medieval woman, that amounted to the same thing. Eleanor of Aquitaine wasn't dangerous because she broke the rules. She was dangerous because she wrote them. And if her desires were painted as bizarre by the men who feared her, that only proves how little room they'd left in their worldview for a woman who refused to shrink. And yet, even Eleanor's mythos pales next to the dark legend that clung to Isabella of France. The queen who turned against her husband, played power like a blade, and was remembered as the she-wolf of France, not for her crimes, but for daring to want more than silence. 20. Isabella of France. Few queens have earned a nickname with as much venom and theatrical flair as Isabella of France, forever branded the she-wolf of France. It sounds like something from a Gothic novel. Part monster, part seductress, all menace. And yet, beneath the layers of political slander and posthumous moral panic, Isabella's life tells a more nuanced and far more unsettling story. She was not monstrous, she was meticulous, and the passions she's remembered for weren't simply personal, they were revolutionary. Born to the powerful French king Philip IV and married off to England's Edward II at the age of 12, Isabella arrived in her new kingdom as a diplomatic pawn draped in jewels. But she wasn't naive. Even as a child, Isabella had been raised in a court where politics were brutal and personal ambition was sharpened like a dagger. She quickly recognized that her husband's affections were elsewhere. Edward II's intense relationship with his favorite, Piers Gaveston, was no secret. Theirs was a bond that raised eyebrows, even in a time when male companionship could be deeply affectionate without accusation. But Gaveston's dominance at court, both politically and emotionally, left Isabella isolated, humiliated, and eventually enraged. When Gaveston was executed by nobles fed up with his influence, Isabella might have hoped for a more balanced marriage. Instead, new favorites took his place, most infamously the Despencer family, whose grip on the king only tightened as Isabella's own influence faded. The court turned colder. Her power diminished. Her household was restricted. At one point, she was forced to hand over her own jewels, family heirlooms from France, to the Despensers. It was a slow public degradation. And yet Isabella did not collapse. She waited. In 1325, she traveled to France under the pretext of diplomatic negotiations. Once there, she refused to return to England. Instead, she aligned herself with a disgraced nobleman, Roger Mortimer, a man exiled by Edward, now living under the radar in Paris. What began as a political alliance quickly deepened into something far more personal. Chroniclers claim they became lovers, conspirators, even co-rulers in exile. And while the intimate details remain murky, what's undeniable is that they plotted a return to England, not as diplomats, but as revolutionaries. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a modest force. To everyone's astonishment, they succeeded. Edward II was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and eventually died in captivity under circumstances that remain suspiciously poetic. Isabella ruled as regent alongside Mortimer for several years in which she wielded unprecedented authority for a woman in medieval Europe. But power, especially when worn by a woman, never goes unpunished. The same nobles who once welcomed her turned on her. Her son, Edward III, eventually seized control, executed Mortimer, and exiled his mother from politics, though not from court. Isabella spent her final years in relative peace, but her legend refused to retire. She was immortalized not as a political strategist or queen regent, but as a lustful traitor who let passion overrule duty. Her enemies recast her as a cautionary tale, a queen who dared to desire too much, both emotionally and politically. But perhaps that's the real reason her story endures. Because Isabella didn't just challenge a husband or a court, she challenged the moral architecture of monarchy itself. And if Isabella turned rebellion into romance, the next queen turned war into appetite. Margaret of Anjou wasn't merely a consort. She was a thunderstorm in velvet, accused of wielding masculine passions in a kingdom that could barely stomach feminine opinions. 21. Margaret of Anjou. Margaret of Anjou didn't walk into English history so much as crash into it like a wave tearing through a stone chapel. Fiercely intelligent, politically assertive, and, according to her enemies, dangerously passionate, Margaret became one of the most polarizing queens England had ever seen. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was mythologized into legend and Isabella of France into menace, Margaret was caricatured into monstrosity. Not because she was cruel or reckless, but because she was loud in a world that expected royal women to whisper. She married Henry VI in 1445 at the age of 15. A French princess married off to the deeply pious, emotionally fragile King of England in a bid to cement peace during the 100 Years' War. The match was meant to stabilize England's uneasy grip on France. It did the opposite. Henry, plagued by catatonic episodes and debilitating passivity, was a poor match for a young queen trained in the art of continental diplomacy and dynastic survival. Margaret entered court life to find herself not beside a king, but in place of one, expected to act without ever being seen as acting. So she did, boldly, openly, strategically. When Henry descended into a near catatonic state in 1453, Margaret took control. She became the de facto ruler during his incapacity and positioned herself at the center of power. But her assertiveness, in an England already fracturing along the lines of the Wars of the Roses, made her a lightning rod. She was accused of overstepping, of scheming, of corrupting the king's fragile mind. And then came the darker rumors that her son, Edward of Westminster, wasn't the king's child at all, but the result of an affair with one of her loyal courtiers. There's no evidence for this, but facts mattered less than the idea of a queen with appetites, political or otherwise. To Margaret's enemies, the notion that she might assert herself in statecraft was already scandalous. To imply that her sexual conduct was also unruly simply sealed the narrative. She became, in the Yorkist imagination, a hybrid of Jezebel and lioness, a Frenchwoman with masculine passions, too proud, too ambitious, too powerful for her own good. But Margaret wasn't just a symbol, she was a strategist. She raised armies to defend her son's claim to the throne. She led campaigns. She negotiated with foreign courts. At one point, she dragged her teenage son across a snow-covered countryside, personally pleading with allies to protect him. Her life was one long act of survival in the face of dynastic collapse. When her forces lost at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, her son was killed. She was captured and held prisoner. Broken, yes, but never quite erased. After years of captivity, she was ransomed back to France, where she lived quietly, stripped of her power but never of her legacy. History did not treat her kindly. Chroniclers called her unnatural, unfeminine, cruel. She was said to have a man's heart in a woman's breast, which in medieval England was not a compliment. It was an accusation. The fact that she dared to fight, to lead, to want, and to protect was seen not as virtue, but as vice. And so Margaret became another cautionary tale. A woman who refused to yield, who tried to rule in a kingdom where power was only holy if a man held it. But if Margaret was painted as too forceful in life, the next queen was judged for something subtler and stranger, an almost devotional attachment that raised eyebrows in monastic corners. Emma of Normandy, queen to two kings, earned a reputation not for sin, but for the unsettling intensity of her loyalties. 22. Emma of Normandy. Emma of Normandy was never meant to be remembered for scandal. She was meant to be remembered for survival. Twice a queen, first to Ethelred the Unready, then to Canute the Great, and mother to two future kings, Emma moved through the early 11th century not with a sword or seduction, but with an eerie kind of stillness. She held power quietly. She played politics without shouting. And yet, even in her calculated restraint, the whispers followed her. They always do, when a woman lives too long, influences too much, and appears to care too deeply. Born into the Norman ducal family, Emma was married off to Ethelred as part of a strategic alliance between England and Normandy. He was older, troubled, and, as his unfortunate epithet suggests, not particularly good at anything. Their marriage was less about affection than necessity, an attempt to patch over English instability with Norman silk. Emma, fluent in court life and more politically astute than most of her new husband's advisors, settled into her role with deliberate composure. But then came Canute. When Ethelred died and England fell to Danish conquest, Emma did something few expected. She married the conqueror. It wasn't just a political move, it was a public reversal. A queen consort, widow of the English king, now aligning herself with the Viking invader. And not just aligning, devoting. Chroniclers were stunned. Her swift remarriage raised suspicions. Was she opportunistic, disloyal, or simply choosing power over sentiment? To many, it was a betrayal. To Emma, it was survival. Her marriage to Canute was, by all accounts, more harmonious than her first. She maintained her political presence. She issued charters, sponsored religious houses, and acted as a cultural mediator between her Norman roots and her Danish husband's court. But it was her emotional proximity to Canute that disturbed her critics most. She wasn't merely respectful, she was reverent, devoted, almost worshipful. Letters and charters emphasized her loyalty to Canute, with language that was unusually intense for the period. She referred to herself as his faithful queen, even after his death. And it was after Canute's death that her legacy turned darker. With multiple heirs vying for the throne, her sons from both marriages, and Canute's other children from previous unions, Emma found herself navigating one of the most dangerous successions in English history. She backed one son, then another. She was accused of plotting, of favoritism, of pitting child against child. Her enemies painted her as scheming. Her defenders described her as fiercely maternal. But what both sides agreed on was this: she was never neutral. The final insult came from within her own lifetime. The Encomium Emmae Reginae, a text she commissioned to justify her actions and preserve her image. It was part biography, part propaganda, and part desperate self-defense. In it, she elevated Canute, minimized Ethelred, and subtly reshaped her own narrative as a queen, led by divine loyalty and political necessity. But the sheer need for such a work reveals how much suspicion surrounded her, and how deeply her affections, particularly for Canute, had unsettled the men who came after. Emma wasn't scandalous in the traditional sense. She didn't chase lovers, break marriages, or flaunt convention. But she loved selectively, fiercely, and with an intensity that made her dangerous. And in the early medieval world, that was enough to stain her story with suspicion. Yet if Emma's devotion to one man raised eyebrows, the next queen's rumored entanglements were considered far worse, especially since they involved not one, but several clerics. Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I, wore a crown and a cross, but court gossip wondered if she wore them both a little too comfortably. 23. Matilda of Scotland. Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I, was supposed to be the respectable one, the safe choice. A queen to cleanse the royal image after years of conquest, rebellion, and unchecked appetite. She was royal by birth, deeply pious, and raised in a convent. A woman who practically glowed with virtue, or so the court wanted to believe. But even queens wrapped in cloisters and crowned with hymns don't escape gossip. And in Matilda's case, the whispers were particularly sharp, particularly persistent, and perhaps most scandalously, quietly plausible. Born Edith of Scotland, she was descended from both Anglo-Saxon royalty and the Scottish throne. Her mother was Saint Margaret of Scotland, and her father, Malcolm III, a warrior king. Her early education took place in a religious environment so strict it practically branded her with sainthood in waiting. She lived in a convent from childhood, which would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse. When Henry I, fresh off the political chaos following his brother William Rufus's mysterious death, needed to marry a woman with Anglo-Saxon blood to legitimize his shaky claim to the English throne, Edith was the perfect candidate. But there was a problem. No one was sure she was legally eligible to marry, because her time in the convent raised questions. Had she taken vows? Had she become a nun? Was she technically married to the church? The debate was not minor. A queen's legitimacy mattered, and the court couldn't have the King of England marrying a woman already spiritually wed to God. Matilda insisted she had never taken formal vows. Some witnesses backed her. Others weren't so sure, and just like that, her sanctity began to crack under the weight of suspicion. Even after her marriage to Henry was approved and she was crowned as Matilda, adopting a more traditionally royal name, rumors continued to circle. In the years following her ascension, court gossip occasionally dredged up an older, murkier story, that her religious education had not been entirely reserved, that she had formed inappropriate friendships with men of the cloth during her time in the convent, that at least one cleric had been unusually attentive. The tales were vague and likely weaponized by enemies, but they stuck. None of it was proven, but none of it had to be. Matilda's image as a queen was shaped not only by what she did, but by what people expected her to be. And once those expectations cracked, even slightly, the moral overcorrections began. Chroniclers took notice of her confidence, her political involvement, her sharp intellect. They didn't praise her for it. They called it masculine, unwomanly. One monk claimed she was imperious in nature, a coded warning about a woman who acted as though she were more than decorative. And perhaps she was. Matilda was a powerful queen consort who acted as regent in her husband's absence and was actively involved in the education of their children, including her daughter, also named Matilda, who would later wage a war for the English crown. She promoted religious institutions, engaged with scholars, and reshaped the cultural image of queenship in her generation. But no amount of charity or courtly elegance could erase the stain of those early rumors. The idea of a queen educated by nuns who might have strayed into emotional entanglements with clerics, real or invented, was too tempting for medieval minds to ignore. And if Matilda's faith made her vulnerable to innuendo, the next queen weaponized her foreign customs into something even more unsettling. Eleanor of Provence didn't just bring romance to court. She brought rituals, tastes, and traditions that English chroniclers found almost unholy. 24. Eleanor of Provence. When Eleanor of Provence arrived in England in 1236 to marry King Henry III, she brought with her more than just an impressive dowry and a polished French education. She carried perfumes, troubadour poetry, embroidered silks, and, according to many of her new subjects, foreign decadence. To a kingdom still slogging through the gray mud of early medieval piety, Eleanor's courtly sensibilities felt less like cultural enrichment and more like a continental invasion. She was elegant, young, and thoroughly un-English. Fluent in Latin, versed in the laws of courtly love, and surrounded by relatives and attendants who preferred southern sunlight to northern stoicism, Eleanor set to work transforming the royal court into something closer to a Provençal salon. And it didn't go unnoticed. English nobles, already uneasy with a French queen, began to whisper, first about her extravagance, then about her influence, and eventually about her taste for affection that seemed, in their words, unfit for an English queen. It wasn't that Eleanor had affairs. There's no solid evidence she did. The scandal was subtler, stranger. She was accused of bringing emotional practices from her homeland that blurred the expected boundaries between propriety and passion. Satirical poems and moral sermons mocked her alleged indulgence in romantic pageantry. She was said to host private gatherings where the rules of courtly love were recited like scripture. Some swore she encouraged her ladies-in-waiting to perform scenes of longing and poetic devotion, rituals that, to English eyes, looked suspiciously like flirtation with costumes. She was fond of music, pageants, stylized dances, and symbolic gifts. Lovers' tokens, anonymous verses, secret glances, all part of the cultural fabric she grew up with. In Provence, these weren't scandalous. They were tradition. But in 13th century England, they looked dangerously like performance art with emotional consequences. One monk even accused her of unwomanly boldness, not because of any political act, but because she was seen smiling too freely with visiting courtiers and engaging too warmly in poetry exchanges. Worse still, she was unapologetic. Eleanor didn't retreat from the gossip. She expanded her influence. She filled the royal court with her relatives, known collectively and bitterly as the Savoyards, and granted them positions of power, titles, and land. This incensed the English barons, who already viewed her as an outsider corrupting their king. They couldn't attack her for actual crimes, so they targeted the only weapons available: reputation, affection, and the thin line between ritual and desire. Eleanor's real offense wasn't immorality. It was intimacy, performed publicly and without shame. She embraced her role not just as queen, but as a patron of a lifestyle that valued emotional expression, symbolic romance, and refined sensitivity. A queen who turned state dinners into theater. A woman who believed the crown should feel like something. She died long after her husband, having outlived most of her enemies and even taking a religious habit in her later years. But her legend lingered, not in the usual scandals of flesh and betrayal, but in the uneasy memory of a woman who brought foreign feelings into an English court and refused to pretend that they were indecent. And while Eleanor infused love with ritual, the next royal twisted that same ritual into something far darker. Anne Boleyn didn't just attract desire, she weaponized it. And for that, the world called her a witch. 25. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn didn't just enter history, she tore through it like a well-dressed thunderclap. Clever, poised, and inconveniently alluring, she didn't play by the rules of queenship because the rules hadn't yet accounted for someone like her. To her supporters, she was a reformer, a modern woman, a political genius in pearls. To her enemies, she was a seductress, a manipulator, and, most notoriously, a witch. Not because of what she did, necessarily, but because of how completely she refused to disappear. Her rise was a scandal before it even had a climax. She was never meant to be queen. She wasn't even supposed to be mistress. Henry VIII had already taken her sister, Mary Boleyn, as a lover, and assumed Anne would follow the same script. But she didn't. She made him wait. Years of waiting. Years of letters, gifts, poetry, and frustration. For the first time, a king used longing as currency, and Anne became its careful banker. To the court, her refusal to become another passing pleasure was both admirable and deeply suspicious. She was a lady-in-waiting with the attitude of a duchess, and her ability to maintain Henry's obsession without surrendering to it made her magnetic and dangerous. English nobles and foreign ambassadors began to whisper. Was she withholding affection as a strategy? Was her charm natural or rehearsed? Was she in love, or was this a performance? No one could quite tell, and that was exactly how she liked it. When she finally became queen, it wasn't through accident or inheritance, it was through replacement. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside after 20 years of marriage, an unprecedented move that shook Christendom. And Anne, the replacement wife, bore the full weight of the fallout. The Pope excommunicated Henry. The people grumbled. And yet, there she was, crowned and crowned again, radiant and unreadable. And then, the child came. A girl, Elizabeth. A disappointment according to the court. A failure to fulfill the central purpose of queenship. Still, Anne held her position for a while longer, but Henry's affections were cooling, and Anne, with her sharp tongue and quick mind, was not the sort of woman to coo and submit. When the end came, it came fast, and it came loud. She was accused of adultery, incest, treason, and yes, witchcraft. She had, according to her enemies, seduced half the men in court. She had cast spells. She had bewitched the king. That word again, bewitched. Not unfaithful, not manipulative, magical. Because how else to explain a woman so thoroughly in control of a king's heart? She was executed in 1536, head severed in a single stroke, and her name sealed in scandal. But centuries later, we still ask the same question. Was Anne guilty of anything other than refusing to be passive? If Anne Boleyn turned the politics of desire into a royal revolution, the next queen wrapped hers in something gentler, but no less intriguing. Queen Adeliza of Louvain was remembered for beauty, but it was her strangely tender warmth, just slightly too warm, that kept the court wondering. 26. Queen Adeliza of Louvain. Queen Adeliza of Louvain, second wife of King Henry I, lived in a quieter corner of English history, polished, pious, and, according to every chronicle that bothered to mention her, astonishingly beautiful. She was nicknamed the Fair Maid of Brabant, a title so poetically bland it almost dares you not to look closer. But behind the soft focus and saintly brushstrokes, there lingers a curious tension in her legacy. For all her supposed modesty and chastity, Adeliza was remembered, uncomfortably, for the sheer emotional warmth she exuded. Not inappropriate exactly, just noticeable. In a court where queens were supposed to smile politely and blend into the stained glass, Adeliza glowed. She was only about 18 when she married Henry I, a king in his 50s, whose appetite for control was rivaled only by his appetite for heirs. He had dozens of illegitimate children, but after the death of his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster, the crown's future became a crisis. Enter Adeliza, young, noble, and politically advantageous. Her main task was clear: produce an heir. But despite a marriage that lasted 15 years, no children ever came. This biological silence became part of her legend. Some took it as a mark of divine modesty, as though she were too pure for conception. Others found it more puzzling. The king had certainly proven fertile elsewhere. Was it her body, her will, or something less tangible? Some chroniclers, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a queen who shared a bed for over a decade and remained childless, began hinting that perhaps she had other affections, softer attachments, warmer friendships, shared with the women of her household in ways that teetered on too intense. There were poems, letters, descriptions of how her presence elevated the spirit and nourished the soul, phrasing that, while typical of medieval courtly writing, took on strange hues when repeated often in the same context. She was known to take long retreats with her ladies. She formed unusually strong bonds with certain companions. The details are vague, always vague, but they were enough to spark theories, some from modern scholars, others from whispering monks. After Henry's death, Adeliza remarried, and did so with suspicious speed. Her second husband was William d'Aubigny, a nobleman of decent standing, though far below royal rank. With him, she had at least 7 children, which only deepened the mystery. How had the radiant, heirless Queen of England become overnight a prolific mother? Perhaps she had simply been unlucky with Henry. Perhaps her fertility was never the point. Or perhaps her time as queen had been occupied less by royal duty and more by something emotionally private, tender, intense, and not meant for public record. Adeliza never courted scandal, but she never quite shook it off either. Her warmth wasn't loud, but it lingered, and sometimes even a whisper of affection, too close, too frequent, too inexplicable, is enough to make a queen memorable. Yet if Adeliza's mysteries lived in quiet affection, the next royal made hers unmistakably public. Mary Tudor, Queen of France, played the court like a ballroom, bold, laughing, and just a little too daring for her brother Henry VIII's liking. 27. Mary Tudor, Queen of France. Mary Tudor, youngest daughter of Henry VII and sister to the infamous Henry VIII, was royalty with a theatrical streak, and just enough reckless charisma to scandalize 2 kingdoms before she was 30. Known for her beauty, her boldness, and her complete disregard for decorum when romance was involved, Mary didn't tiptoe through the expectations of court life. She danced through them, in French silks, with the wrong man on her arm. She was married off young, as all good princesses were. At 18, she became Queen Consort of France, wed to the aging King Louis XII. The match was strategic, political, predictable, and utterly miserable, for her at least. Louis, in his 50s, hoped to produce an heir. Mary, fluent in flirtation and not particularly subtle, made no secret of her displeasure. The French court noticed. So did the English ambassadors. She charmed the courtiers, laughed a little too loudly at banquets, and was quickly known for her dazzling presence, a light too bright for such a dim marriage. Louis died less than 3 months later, exhausted or merely outmatched, depending on the chronicler. Mary, now a dowager queen with diplomatic value and more freedom than most women in Europe, should have awaited her next arranged marriage. Instead, she acted. Before even returning to England, she secretly married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, her brother's best friend and a man with neither a crown nor permission. It was, by Tudor standards, a double scandal. Not only had she defied royal matchmaking, she had done it while still in the French spotlight, barely widowed, with a marriage that Henry VIII had very much not approved. When the news reached England, Henry was furious. His reaction was less about morality and more about control. Mary had made a mockery of royal policy. She'd turned her widowhood into a romantic getaway. And the worst part? The public loved it. She was a heroine in a court increasingly ruled by rigid protocol, a princess who followed her heart and dragged a duke into marriage before the crown could stop her. To save face, Henry fined the couple an enormous sum, and the story was spun into a narrative of royal forgiveness. But Mary never apologized. She never played the penitent sister, and she never stopped making eyes roll at court. Her tastes, it was said, were expressive, her behavior vivacious, her fashion flamboyant. She hosted performances, flirted with foreign dignitaries, and carried herself like a woman who knew exactly how far she could push a boundary and enjoyed brushing against it. Mary died at just 37, but not before securing her place as one of the most memorably unruly women in Tudor history. Not because she committed treason, not because she wielded political power, but because she had the audacity to love boldly and publicly, in a world that expected princesses to smile politely and wait their turn. And if Mary's flair came wrapped in royal ribbons, the next Duchess played her scandal out in the shadows of marital war. Elizabeth Stafford, Duchess of Norfolk, didn't seduce courts. She survived them, and the accusations that came with being a wife too stubborn to break. 28. Elizabeth Stafford, Duchess of Norfolk. Elizabeth Stafford's story doesn't begin with seduction, but with survival, though somewhere along the way, those two concepts started to look dangerously similar. As the daughter of Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, and wife to Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth sat at the epicenter of Tudor power. She was born into privilege, married into strategy, and expected to perform the one role aristocratic women knew best: obedient wife, silent partner, moral ornament. She did not comply. Her marriage to Thomas Howard was, on paper, a dynastic success. It united two great houses, secured political alliances, and aligned her with the most influential family in Henry VIII's court. But behind the glittering facade, the relationship was a Gothic drama, complete with accusations of cruelty, manipulation, and something far more taboo: obsessive emotional warfare. Howard, a man feared and respected in equal measure, was a career survivor of Henry VIII's reign. He was cold, cunning, and reputed to be ruthlessly ambitious. Elizabeth, by contrast, was spirited and pious, but not quiet. She spoke her mind. She pushed back. She refused to disappear into the background. And when the marriage deteriorated, as it inevitably did, both sides began to sling accusations so personal they read like diary entries left open on a court bench. Elizabeth accused her husband of publicly humiliating her, of abandoning her emotionally, and of having a long-standing affair with one of her own ladies-in-waiting. But more than that, she claimed he demanded a level of submission that was not just controlling, but psychologically invasive. She resisted, and in resisting, became the villain in her husband's version of the story. Howard, for his part, claimed Elizabeth was unnaturally jealous, a term that, in Tudor language, translated loosely to inconveniently aware. He cast her as hysterical, unreasonable, and emotionally excessive. Letters between the two paint a picture not just of marital breakdown, but of something closer to romantic siege warfare. Each party entrenched, each refusing to surrender, each convinced of their own righteousness. The court didn't know what to make of her. Some viewed Elizabeth as a victim of aristocratic entitlement. Others whispered that her obsessive grievances masked deeper passions. She wrote that her husband had cast her off like an old shoe, and her letters are filled with language that vacillates between wounded pride and lingering attachment. Critics and defenders alike speculated, was this the voice of a woman betrayed, or one who loved too fiercely to let go? Her refusal to step aside quietly made her dangerous. She refused to accept a formal separation. She remained legally married to a man who publicly paraded his mistress, and she documented her rage with unnerving precision. Her letters were both testimony and performance, raw, rhetorical, and unsettlingly intimate. Elizabeth Stafford didn't chase scandal. She became it, simply by refusing to let the world tell her how much hurt was appropriate, how much anger was allowed, and how quiet a woman should be when her love curdled into fury. And if Elizabeth's war was fought in letters and silence, the next Duchess on our list inherited a different kind of romantic stain. Isabella Neville, Duchess of Clarence, whose reputation was shaped not by lovers, but by dynastic betrayal, and an affection history has never quite forgiven. 29. Isabella Neville, Duchess of Clarence. Isabella Neville was born into power, married into ambition, and buried beneath a legend that never quite decided whether to pity her, fear her, or blame her. As the elder daughter of Richard Neville, better known as Warwick the Kingmaker, Isabella was at the center of England's most unstable century. She was a duchess by title, but the court remembered her less for her jewels and more for her proximity to betrayal and affection, unruly, obsessive, and perhaps a little too useful. Her father, Warwick, was the architect of kings. First, he helped Edward IV seize the throne. Then, when Edward proved unmanageable, he changed sides and tried to replace him. Isabella was a chess piece in this Game of Thrones, married off to George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, Edward's younger brother, ambitious, erratic, and perpetually aggrieved. The match was politically explosive. Edward had forbidden it. They did it anyway. From the beginning, Isabella and George's marriage was more than a love match. It was a declaration of war. And war, in the 15th century, rarely stayed on the battlefield. Their union was romanticized by supporters and condemned by royalists. But it was what happened after the vows that kept chroniclers interested. George and Isabella were deeply attached, unusually so. Even for the standards of the time, their bond was intense, some said consuming. When George plotted rebellions against his own brother, Isabella stood by him. When Warwick betrayed the king, Isabella didn't flinch. She was said to be not only loyal to her husband, but emotionally invested in his cause to an almost disturbing degree. To some, it was noble. To others, it was dangerously entangled. After Warwick's death in battle and the collapse of his rebellion, Isabella and George were given a second chance at court. But their return came with conditions, and wounds that hadn't healed. The couple's position was never stable. Paranoia grew, ambition curdled, and then tragedy struck. In 1476, Isabella gave birth to a son. Within months, she was dead. The official cause was complications from childbirth. The unofficial cause was speculation. Poison, some said. Poison perhaps delivered not by a court enemy, but, more chillingly, by her own husband. The rumor had roots. In the months after her death, George became increasingly erratic. He accused members of her household of poisoning her. He demanded revenge. He interrogated servants. He publicly defied the king. It wasn't just grief. It was obsession, channeled into conspiracy. And as George spiraled, so did his fate. He was eventually arrested for treason and in one of the most infamous episodes of Plantagenet history, executed, allegedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Isabella's name became a footnote in the bloody decline of the House of York. But beneath the battles and executions, her memory carried a peculiar charge. She wasn't remembered for courtly grace or political cunning. She was remembered for a marriage so passionately aligned with rebellion that even death didn't untangle it. And if Isabella Neville died enmeshed in dynastic love and loss, the next queen carried those same strange passions into legend. Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III, may have ruled quietly, but the stories whispered behind her tapestries were anything but. 30. Queen Philippa of Hainault. Queen Philippa of Hainault was, by most historical standards, a success story. She married young, produced a dynasty, soothed a volatile king, and managed not to be executed, exiled, or accused of sorcery, a rare achievement for a medieval queen consort. She was praised for her gentleness, her charity, and her famously tearful plea that spared the lives of 6 burghers of Calais. A model of virtue, they said. A pious queen, they insisted. A quiet power behind the throne. And yet, even in her polished legacy, there's something oddly persistent. Something that doesn't quite align with the alabaster saint of Victorian textbooks. Stories, poems, eyebrow-raising anecdotes that never made it into royal chronicles but clung to her name like perfume in an old robe. Queen Philippa, it seems, may have been a little more continental in her affections than the English were entirely comfortable with. Born in Hainault, a wealthy region straddling modern-day Belgium and France, Philippa was raised in a court where culture, pageantry, and intimacy were closely intertwined. When she married Edward III in 1328, she brought that world with her. Her tastes were French, her manners foreign, Her household included musicians, astrologers, and advisors who operated with a very different understanding of personal space and emotional etiquette than the stiff-lipped English nobility. At first, this was seen as charming, then as distracting, and eventually as suspicious. While Edward waged war abroad and laid the foundations of the 100 Years' War, Philippa remained in England, managing domestic affairs and shaping the court. She surrounded herself with companions, many of them women of literary or artistic talent, people who understood the emotional nuance of the courtly love tradition that Philippa never quite abandoned. To some, these relationships were harmless. To others, they seemed a little too theatrical. One recurring rumor was that Philippa maintained emotional chambers in her household, spaces dedicated to reading poetry aloud, exchanging symbolic gifts, and, more curiously, reenacting romantic allegories with costumed courtiers. These were said to be inspired by the Roman de la Rose and similar continental works, texts not known for their restraint. Were these gatherings truly provocative, or just misunderstood by suspicious monks with no patience for metaphor? It didn't help that her ladies-in-waiting often shared unusually close bonds with her. Letters survive, cryptic, affectionate, and at times overly florid, suggesting that Philippa valued emotional depth far beyond what was expected. One poem refers to a midnight bond of hearts unshuttered, addressed not to the king, but to an unnamed companion. Was it literary excess, courtly custom, or something less platonic? We'll never know. Philippa died with her reputation largely intact, but not unmarked. Her kindness became legend. Her eccentricities quietly filed under continental excess. She was the queen who brought feeling into form, who turned emotional intimacy into ceremony, and whose harmless affection left just enough of a scent to make later historians raise an eyebrow. And while Philippa's legacy was padded with poetry, the next woman's reputation was soaked in accusation. Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, wasn't just scandal-prone, she was scandal-magnetized, pulled by passions that defied both crown and consequence. 31. Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox. Margaret Douglas was born into intrigue and never quite found the exit. As the niece of Henry VIII and granddaughter of Henry VII, she was close enough to the Tudor throne to be useful, and close enough to be dangerous. Her entire life was defined by proximity to power and the consequences of loving outside the palace-approved list. If her name isn't as instantly infamous as her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, or her uncle Henry VIII, that's only because her scandals never ended in a crown or a beheading. But they did leave bruises, personal, political, and thoroughly documented. Margaret's earliest misstep, if one could call it that, came in the form of romance. In the 1530s, while living under the watchful eye of her uncle Henry at court, she fell in love with Lord Thomas Howard. A Howard. A noble, yes, but also the brother of the ill-fated Queen Anne Boleyn and uncle to another doomed queen, Catherine Howard. The match was unapproved. Worse, it was potentially treasonous. In a world where bloodlines determined succession, Margaret's closeness to the throne meant any romantic involvement had implications far beyond the heart. They had pledged themselves in secret. Some claim they even considered themselves married. When Henry found out, the punishment was swift and severe. Thomas was thrown into the Tower, where he died shortly after, and Margaret was imprisoned in the nunnery at Sion Abbey. The official crime? Interfering with the succession. The real crime? Falling in love with someone powerful enough to matter, but not powerful enough to control. You might think this would have taught her caution. It didn't. Margaret would go on to orchestrate not one, but two more romantic entanglements that threw her household into scandal. This time, it was her sons. She arranged for her eldest son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, another niece of Henry VIII, another heir with too much bloodline. The union set off alarm bells in England. A union between Darnley and Mary meant their future child could potentially unite the English and Scottish crowns, threatening Elizabeth I's grip on the throne. Margaret was promptly imprisoned again. Her second son also married without Elizabeth's permission, earning Margaret yet another stint under house arrest. One chronicler referred to her as having a restless nature, a diplomatic phrase often used when women refused to abandon their affections for the sake of state. Throughout it all, Margaret remained defiant. She wrote letters filled with poetic laments, declarations of loyalty, and unsubtle jabs at the monarchs who continued to cage her. She loved too dangerously, planned too ambitiously, and suffered for it, repeatedly. Margaret Douglas never claimed the throne, but her heart did more damage than many who wore the crown ever managed. And if Margaret's love affairs nearly toppled dynasties, the next woman's passions never left the page, but were no less electric. Elizabeth of Bohemia, the so-called Winter Queen, flirted with politics, poetry, and power in ways that made even her exile shine with theatrical intensity. 32. Elizabeth of Bohemia. Elizabeth of Bohemia, daughter of James I of England, and granddaughter of Mary, Queen of Scots, was royalty with the soul of a dramatist. She lived most of her life in exile, lost a crown in a matter of months, and still managed to capture the imagination of poets, diplomats, and political dreamers from England to the Holy Roman Empire. They called her the Winter Queen because her reign in Bohemia lasted one icy season, but it was her warmth, her flair for theatrical affection, and her notorious emotional charisma that left the deeper mark. From a young age, Elizabeth was a courtly jewel, clever, spirited, fluent in languages, and trained in the subtle art of flirtation that hovered just above suspicion. Ambassadors described her as lively in discourse, gracious in countenance, and exceedingly fond of conversation. That last part became something of a pattern. She married Frederick V, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, in 1613. It was a politically advantageous match, but not without real affection, at least in the beginning. Their union produced 13 children and one of the most ill-fated monarchies in European history. Frederick accepted the throne of Bohemia in 1619, and by 1620 they had both been driven into exile, chased from Prague by the Catholic Habsburgs, and left to rebuild their court in The Hague. But Elizabeth didn't retreat quietly. Her court in exile became a strange, electric bubble of displaced nobility, poets, theologians, and nervous ambassadors. And at the center was Elizabeth, laughing, scheming, reciting, writing. She was beloved, but also observed. Her emotional attachments were the subject of intense court scrutiny. She wrote affectionate letters to male and female courtiers alike, letters rich with poetic metaphors, devotional language, and a slightly too intimate tone for what the English crown considered appropriate. Some of her friendships were described as unusually intense. A few attracted political concern. There were rumors, not of affairs, but of emotional entanglements that blurred the line between political alliance and personal obsession. Even her friendships with other exiled noblewomen were described in terms that raised eyebrows. Constant companions, inseparable confidants, always found in discourse, sometimes in tears. A queen in exile, after all, wasn't supposed to behave like the heroine in a romantic play. And yet, Elizabeth did. She was theatrical, affectionate, and dramatic in her displays. Her court didn't operate by the cold arithmetic of dynastic strategy. It hummed with emotion. One ambassador reported that she had the habits of a muse more than a monarch. Another, less politely, called her overfond of sentiment. She never returned to Bohemia. She died in England, having outlived her husband and many of her children, remembered less as a queen than as a kind of lost symbol. Gracious, tragic, and a little too alive for the role history had assigned her. And if Elizabeth of Bohemia's exile turned affection into theater, the next queen made devotion a performance so intense it bordered on obsession. Mary II may have ruled with dignity, But behind the stiff portraits and Protestant duty was a private attachment to her husband that left satirists wondering, how much love is too much? 33. Queen Mary. Queen Mary II is often remembered as half of a successful political partnership, the Protestant heroine who helped usher in the Glorious Revolution, reigning alongside her husband, William III, in a neat, respectable dual monarchy. She was dignified, devout, and firmly positioned as the moral contrast to her Catholic father, James II. But beneath the polished narrative of duty and divine right lies a more curious legacy, one of excessive devotion, theatrical submission, and a kind of emotional fidelity that made even her admirers slightly uncomfortable. Mary and William's marriage was not a love match, not at first. She was 15 when it was arranged, and she reportedly cried for days upon hearing the news. William of Orange, her Dutch cousin, was 10 years older, awkward in social settings, and about as romantic as a bucket of ice water. But over time, something shifted. Mary not only accepted the marriage, she attached herself to William with such fervor that it startled the court. Her love was not just visible, it was consuming. She followed him across Europe, adapted to his austere lifestyle, and wrote letters full of devotion, self-effacement, and emotional transparency. One of her most famous lines, written to William, read, "I am entirely yours, and cannot wish to be other than what you would have me be." It was the kind of sentiment that made poets sigh and political observers squint. Was this love? Or a performance of surrender? At court, Mary's affection became a subject of gossip. She referred to her husband in terms that seemed more poetic than political, and her every decision was filtered through the lens of what would please him. She declined to challenge his authority, even when she was technically co-sovereign. When he was away on campaign, she pined with near ritualistic intensity, hosting religious gatherings in his honor, praying aloud for his safety, and speaking of him as if his absence were a personal affliction. Satirical writers of the day seized on this. Pamphlets circulated suggesting Mary's love for William bordered on fetishistic reverence. One anonymous satire mockingly depicted her as a queen who bowed to her husband even in private, describing her as a subject in crown and lace. Her love, they suggested, wasn't just real. It was too real to be respectable. And in a monarchy built on balance and power, too much devotion could look dangerously like submission. To her defenders, Mary was the epitome of the loyal wife. To her critics, she was an emotional outlier, a woman whose passion for her husband overshadowed her political role. Even her death, at age 32 from smallpox, was interpreted through the lens of marital loyalty. William was devastated, and her final words were said to be of him. In the end, Mary's scandal was not about misbehavior, but overbehavior, an unsettling reminder that even in queens, too much visible love could be mistaken for weakness or worse, for impropriety. And so ends our journey, not with a crime, nor a fall from grace, but with a queen whose greatest transgression may have been loving too deeply in a palace where hearts were expected to bow, not break.